Hi, this is Eric from ADHDgo.com, and today I'm talking to Amber from thewinterofmydiscontent.com about ADHD in women and girls. Hi, Amber.
Hey, how's it going?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well. Doing pretty well.
I'm super excited to be talking to you about the topic that you chose, ADHD in women and girls. As you observed in your article, oftentimes when people think about someone with ADHD, they immediately picture a hyperactive boy. And that stereotype can be so dominant that it actually causes the symptoms for girls to get overlooked.
Right.
And that can cause a lot of girls to go undiagnosed for far longer than boys. Can you tell us a little bit more about why you think that is?
Well, it's definitely ADHD and inattentive ADHD symptoms are often internalized. You don't notice them as much on the outside. Um, Also, we put a lot of pressure on girls to be a certain way, to be kind of sweet and kind and ambitious at the same time. And so that really, it comes off as a character flaw instead of a symptom of something. And we're often told from our earliest times that these are character deficits and that there is something wrong with us as people. And so often we don't even know that they are symptoms of something greater.
That can be so damaging. And with a character flaw like laziness, there's nowhere you can really go with that because we can't really change ourselves. It's a feature of our
Right.
personality, which is why an ADHD diagnosis can be such a lifeline for so many people because symptoms are something that you can change. You can work on symptoms with treatment. It's not yourself that's broken.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And getting diagnosed, I was diagnosed at 38 years old. And I had been in and out of the healthcare system since I was 9, trying to find answers, what was wrong and what was really going on with me. So when I finally found out, it was a revelation. And learning the signs and symptoms that are in women was also a revelation. It was just I felt so seen for the first time.
Tell me more about the feelings that you experienced when you first got your diagnosis. You said you felt seen, and I think that really hits the nail on the head for a big part of it. But at least in my experience, my diagnosis brought a sort of rich cocktail of emotions. So can you speak a little bit more on that?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I felt a lot of anger. What that was one of the most prevalent emotions that I had. Anger that no one caught it before then, and anger that I had been treated poorly throughout my life because of something that ultimately I found out I couldn't control. And so and not by people that I didn't know, treated poorly by the people that I loved. So, it was a lot of anger, sadness. I kind of mourned who I could have been if I had found out sooner. Um, and I also felt a lot of hope and excitement because, like you said, I have something to work towards now. I have answers, and there, there's a vast array of different things that I can use to make my life better now, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, when you said anger, that definitely brought my attention back to these expectations that our society places on women and girls. Like you said, they have to be sweet, they're not supposed to be angry. Of course, the cliche that we always talk about is how boys are said to have leadership qualities, while the same behavior expressed by a girl is called bossy a lot of the time. What other sort of experiences did you feel were kind of misunderstood and were interfering with your self-awareness and holding you back?
Yeah. So some of the the expectations that we get held to are things like girls are expected to be good housekeepers. We are expected to take care of the children and kind of run the household. And, cooking and cleaning is not really the forte of ADHD people. And so that brings a lot of shame with it. And I think that in the beginning, I don't know that it held me back, but I think that it made it easier for me to go, oh man, I'm not lazy. Like, I'm actually not lazy. This is, because you get told that so often, you get told certain things so often that eventually you just kind of take it on as part of who you are, without even realizing it.
100%. Yeah. Laziness is almost always rooted in insecurity or a lack of familiarity with whatever it is we're doing, right? So, like you said, administrative tasks are difficult for anyone with ADHD, but traditionally, those tasks have fallen on women. So, that can be a huge burden for someone, especially with unmanaged symptoms.
Yes. hmm Yeah, and it can be a lot. I've healed a lot since I've learned about my ADHD diagnosis. Just for that simple fact alone is that I've let go of the shame that I've carried for so many years of not being able to do those things. My therapist tells me all the time, she's like, some people are really good at art and some people aren't really good at art. And it's the same thing when it comes to household chores and life duties that things that you have to do in life. Some people are really good at those things and some people aren't, but you're good at other things.
The idea of girls really struggling to arrive at their ADHD diagnosis and understanding of their condition because of some of the things we've talked about really has me curious about your own journey towards getting a diagnosis. How did you discover that ADHD might be affecting your life?
Well, my daughter was diagnosed about 4 or 5 years ago, and she was 5 at the time when she was diagnosed. And in researching ways to try to help her, I started seeing things that rang true for me as well. And when I found out about executive dysfunction, I it, it floored me. I was like, oh my gosh, this describes everything. So I went to my therapist, and I was at a time where I really wanted to put in work and figure out what was going on with me and get better. And so I went to her and I said, can we figure, do some kind of evaluation and see what's going on? And then I mentioned to her that I had read about executive dysfunction. And at this time, I was still not thinking ADHD because I just figured someone would have caught it before then. so, so she said, yeah, I mean, right on the spot, she said, I'm pretty positive that that's you have ADHD.
How did it feel when she said that?
It was surprising. It was really surprising. And I immediately, we scheduled the evaluation and I immediately went home, got on Twitter and started searching ADHD. And that's when I found ADHD Twitter. And reading so many different experiences and just seeing myself in them. I mean, there were times that I cried reading Twitter threads because I felt so seen and validated. And for the first time ever, it's like, I'm not alone in this. There are other people who deal with these same things.
That's wonderful to hear. Yeah. Executive dysfunction can be such a huge part of the ADHD experience that often gets overlooked because, of course, attention deficit hyperactive disorder, nowhere in the label do they mention executive functioning.
Right.
So it makes sense that this symptom would cause you to overlook ADHD as a possibility for what was going on. But that eventually led to you having the conversation that resulted in your diagnosis.
Absolutely.
As the parent of a girl with ADHD, I'm really curious about what advice you would give to another parent of an ADHD girl who might not have as much experience or awareness as you do about some of these issues?
Well, so my daughter has ADHD combined type. So in fact, my whole family has ADHD. My husband has it. He has hyperactive type. I have inattentive, and my daughter has combined. So it's a lot. But the first thing I would tell them is to remember that what you're seeing on the outside is only a small percentage of what is actually going on inside of your child. And so it's important to be patient and try to dig deep with them and find out where certain behaviors are coming from and why they're happening, why they're having trouble with certain things. And honestly, just to try not to be too hard on them. I mean, and it's tough. It's tough not to be hard on them because you want so badly for them to be okay. And so you know that certain behaviors are going to affect them negatively, and you want to help that as much as possible. But you know, it is quite a ride. I don't know. I don't really know what to say because I'm still, as a parent, parenting a child with ADHD, I'm still very much trying to find my footing. It is definitely a journey, and I'm hoping that as I learn about myself, it will help me to understand her better and try to help her journey be a little bit easier as well.
Yeah. One of the things that I'm really curious about is that transition period from girl to adult woman. And I know that you didn't have necessarily the diagnosis
Yeah,
at that time, but looking back, does
right.
anything stand out as clearly being ADHD or anything that was changing about your condition as you matured?
Yeah, so I had a tough transition from a woman to a girl. I think it's hard enough becoming a teenager or a young woman or young person without ADHD. And then when you add the emotions, the intense emotions, and the impulsivity, and you know, all of the things you get, I see so many things now that I did. I mean, I got in a lot of trouble. You know, I ended up having to even stay in juvenile for a couple of nights once because I did not I didn't take the transition well, essentially. Um, and you know, again, if I had known, maybe things would have been different. But um, going through the things that I went through got me on the path that I'm on today. And so that's, you know, they were the things that I had to go through, I guess.
Looking back on those experiences when it felt like you couldn't manage those feelings appropriately, do you think that there's anything that could have helped in those situations? What somebody could have said, or an outlet that you could have had to express those feelings in a more positive way?
Yeah, if the adults in my life at that time had actually tried to understand me as a person, you know, because I think that a lot of times we forget that about young people. Yes, they're young people, but they're their own human beings, and they have you know, a whole bunch of different emotions and feelings and experiences. And so I think that having someone who at least tries to understand where you're coming from makes such a huge difference, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. That can come from so many different places, but it's so much harder in this particular time of social distancing to have those outlets available as far as teachers, peers, after school activities like, you know, coaches. And I think that can be really hard for kids in this present moment, but that's another conversation. Let's dive into some of your tips about ADHD and how they affect women and girls.
Right. So the first one, I wanted to make these as relatable as possible. So the first one that I dealt with was if you've been called lazy for all of your life, and we touched on that earlier, um, that term has been extremely damaging to me. And it has, when you take someone who is trying their absolute best and they're really trying their hardest, and then you tell them that they're just being lazy, it absolutely destroys their self-confidence. And so that is, a pretty good sign that you might have something else going on.
And then probably depression or generalized anxiety disorder are going to spring from that. And as you pointed out in your article, those diagnoses can actually become the gateway to realizing that you also have ADHD as a part of your condition.
Right, right. And even it's so often that providers want to tell women this is depression and anxiety. And then you get to a point where it's so chronic and so severe and nothing's helping, no medications are helping, and they're still saying, oh, it's just depression and anxiety. And so at some point you have to ask yourself, when do we stop just saying it's depression and anxiety? You have to ask for an evaluation. You can't just assume that the doctor will give you one. You have to actually request it most of the time. So it's, that's a lot. So the next thing is wishing that you could take things back. So impulsivity often makes us blurt things out before we think about saying them. It makes us, so I overshare a lot, pretty often actually. And that's part of my ADHD. I don't think you shouldn't tell this person this. I remember a couple of months ago, I went home to visit my sister, and I have two nieces that are teenagers, and we stayed up late talking one night. And then when I went to bed that night, I just laid in bed like, oh no, you totally just overshared with your 16 and 17-year-old nieces. That's awesome. I hope they don't tell their mom.
They probably love that, right?
Yeah, probably.
I think that's one of the interesting paradoxes about ADHD is that we feel like sharing and being vulnerable is cool and relatable, but oftentimes we're completely oblivious to the context and whether that oversharing is actually appropriate for the situation.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah.
As you mentioned, ADHD Twitter can be such a powerful tool for self-discovery in that way because it's specifically designed to convey that kind of tone that's so relatable and really gets to the day-to-day aspects of the experience of living with ADHD.
Yes, absolutely. And when I started my blog, one of the things that I wanted to do, like I felt like a lot of the information about ADHD on the internet was very sterile and clinical. And so, I would read these lists and I would be like, I don't do any of this stuff. But then when I would read about what that actually entailed, I would realize I do all of this stuff. So, I just wanted something that gave the facts, but also shows a personal take on what that means.
Absolutely.
Another thing about ADHD is, and this is in general, but especially for girls and women, we tend to be extremely empathetic. We are, because our life experiences have often been more negative and harder, we have an easier time putting ourselves in other people's shoes and understanding all of the different emotions because we feel them so fiercely. So that's a very common trait. And I do get really overwhelmed with other people's emotions. And being empathetic, it doesn't just include good, good feelings. it also includes, like sometimes my husband's really grumpy in the mornings, like crazy grumpy. And he'll get up and he'll be in a bad mood and he'll be slamming stuff around and just being grumpy. And I take on that mood. But the problem is that after he's had his coffee and he's in a normal mood again and everybody's happy and, their day has moved on, I am still in this terrible mood that I absorbed. So, you have to be really careful. You have to set good boundaries.
I wonder sometimes if that starts as an attempt to relate to somebody by mirroring their behavior and their emotional state.
Mm.
But then, we kind of internalize their feelings and it hijacks our own emotional state. And then we get stuck
Yes,
there.
absolutely. Absolutely. So, another thing is you might have a messy desk, a messy car, or a messy house. As I've said before, we're not that great at those. And I don't want to sound too broad. I don't want to make generalizations. There are some people with ADHD who have spotless houses all of the time. But there are a lot of us who unfortunately have to deal with the messiness.
Yeah, if you don't have a mess in your life with ADHD, then you're either managing your symptoms really well, or there's something else in your life, some other condition or structure that's compensating for that.
Right, exactly. I find that with my impulsivity, it's kind of, I don't really do a whole lot of impulsive things because it's held in check by my anxiety. It kind of holds it all back. So another thing is an all or nothing attitude. So ADHDers tend to see the big picture and only the big picture. We can see that we want to be a best-selling author, but we can't see all the steps in between to actually create a book and market it and, do all of the little things that you need to do to get there. And so we'll go into a project really gung-ho, and then in a week or two, when we're not famous yet, we lose all interest. And so
Or you get depressed.
so yes, yeah, you get depressed. Absolutely. Oh, that's the worst.
Yeah, that all or nothing attitude is such a big part of the ADHD experience. I like to say that ADHD is a condition of extremes where you're either on or you're off. And sometimes I think about this in terms of even self-expression, which can be such an important part of the development of a young person's identity, especially for little girls. That can be fragile, a fragile thing. And, you're trying a lot of different things. And I wonder if you have any tips for people who are going through that experimental phase of building their identity and how they can avoid
Mhm.
some of those extremes that can end in embarrassment or a feeling of
Right.
failure when things don't work out.
Yeah. Well, and this is easier said than done, but the most important thing is to get good at realistic goal setting. And it takes practice, especially for someone with ADHD. It takes a lot of practice to make smart goals and to do those kinds of things. But get good at making realistic goals, because one thing that I've learned in my blogging journey, that because I've always been that way. I'll start blogging or start doing a project, and then after a month I'm over it and I never go back to it. So when I first started blogging, I was like, I don't really want to buy a domain name yet because I don't know if I'm really going to stick to this. But I started setting small goals. I want to get 10 visitors this week, or I want to get 5 likes on this blog post or whatever. And I found that as I was hitting those small goals, my confidence would rise every single time, and my self-esteem, it would give me a boost in my self-esteem. And so I got better at saying, okay, by the end of this year, I want to have 10,000 views, and I felt more confident in doing that. And so, it's important to learn how to do that correctly so that you're always working towards something small instead of staring down the road at what you're really working toward.
Absolutely. That's well said. Small steps with a clear destination in mind.
Yes, yes,
Then you're not
exactly.
trying to just leap straight to the end and potentially falling on your face.
Right, exactly. Yes. So the next one, and this is a big one for me. Sometimes we have an experience where being at work feels physically difficult. Um, my job is not a bad job. It's a good job, but it is probably not the best job for me. And my time there feels excruciating. It's almost a physical reaction. Um, there are days where it feels like torture to be there, and it's because my brain is craving stimulation that job is just not capable of giving me. And so having to sit there for 8 hours in a row 5 days a week is tantamount to torturing me. So that is another sign. If you're out, if I think everybody feels at some point or another feels some dissatisfaction with their job. No job is perfect and nobody's happy in their job at all times. But when it starts to, invade your thoughts when you're outside of work, and when it starts to get to a point where you're having anxiety the whole time you're at work, or those kinds of things, you'll start to get burnout, and burnout can get really chronic. So that is a sign that you might have ADHD.
Yeah, right. I can see just thinking about it is kind of stirring up the anxiety for you.
it it does, it really does. It starts to make you feel, yeah, it's a mess. Another big one for me that I did not realize was a symptom of ADHD is that your mind drifts during conversation. When someone's trying to talk to you, you're thinking about, what you're doing for dinner, or, anything other than what they're saying. Or maybe they might say a word, and that one word just immediately shoots you off into another world. So and that was a big deal. I used to have a friend who used to tell me all the time that she thought I had ADHD, and I'd be like, no, I don't. And she'd be like, our conversations are so crazy, you have to have it. And come to find out, I did.
Yeah, and this goes back to what you were saying about workplace anxiety, because of course, if you're not fully focused on what your boss or your coworker is explaining to you or telling to you, then of course, the project that you're working on is going to have things that you overlook or that go unfinished. Even simple tasks can get derailed by those drifting thoughts, right?
Right. And I find that when someone, like if we're in a group meeting and someone starts talking about something that will eventually affect me but doesn't affect me yet, and as soon as I find out that it's not an immediate need to know thing, my brain tunes right out right away. And I always have to go back and be like, hey, remember that thing we were talking about 2 weeks ago? What was that again? So so let's see. Um, the next item, if you talk a lot. Um, that I've always talked a lot. When I was in probably kindergarten, my report card said Amber talks too much in class. Um, so that is a pretty good sign. It's a way for us to get out our hyperactivity. So um, we may not be jumping off the walls or have real outward signs, but our brains are moving fast, and so our mouths tend to move the same way.
Yeah. This is something that really directly applies to our stereotypes about women and girls.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. It's kind of, I don't know. I never remember boys getting in trouble for talking too much during class so much, but girls often were in trouble. Our desks were always moved up against the teacher's desk, and you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And that can really diminish the possibility that a girl with ADHD is going to pursue the diagnosis and the treatment that she needs.
Absolutely. Um, Another really good sign is that you're not very good with money and budget related items. Um, this is for a lot of different reasons. The two main reasons are impulsivity. We tend to spend money on things that we don't need, or things that are too expensive. We don't think them through before we make our purchases all the time. So that's one of the reasons. And the second reason is budgeting takes planning, and planning is part of executive functioning. And so we have a lot of troubles with that. It's hard to save money when you're also impulsively spending it all in the background. So
Sure. Another common stereotype about women, always buying things,
right.
right?
And yes, it really is. It really is. But it's one of the few ways that I do act really impulsively is with I have ADHD, so I get into hobbies, and then I have to have all of the premium products for the hobby before I get started. And it's a whole thing.
And when you lose interest in that hobby, time for another garage sale.
Right, right. Well, I've actually started kind of a mental lazy Susan. And so I have about 5 or 6 hobbies, and I still spend way too much money on them, but at least I'm spending them on the same hobbies each time. And when I get bored of one hobby, I spin my lazy Susan and pick out the next one and go from there.
That's really interesting. I like that visual. Do you find that thinking about your hobbies in this way kind of helps you limit the number of hobbies you pursue?
It does. I still occasionally try new things, obviously, but I stick with these same main hobbies. And like I crochet, I haven't crocheted in probably 2 years, but I know for sure that a time is going to come where I'm going to absolutely start crocheting again. I've got all the yarn just waiting for me in the closet. So, it just everything kind of comes back around.
It has a right. It has a spot on the lazy Susan. My partner's childhood friend could never remember the term lazy Susan, so she would call it a spin around Judy, which I think is delightful.
Yeah, a spin around Judy. Once my daughter tried to give me a wet willy, and she called it a dry Walter.
Hopefully it was dry, because those things are
Yeah.
awful.
Oh, terrible, terrible.
For your
All right.
lazy Susan technique, do you have a hard limit on the number of hobbies that you put on there, that you would recommend for people?
Well, I have about 5 or 6 that I rotate through. Um, I I don't know that I would do too many more than that, because then you're just going to get overwhelmed and you're going to have a bunch of stuff sitting around that you're not using all the time. I also try to do hobbies that kind of interweave with each other so that I can use the same supplies um, for them. Like I do bullet journaling, but I also do art journaling. So I'm able to kind of mix and match my supplies for that. And that helps with space and, keeping everything together and whatnot. But yeah, I'd say 5 or 6 would probably be a good number.
That's a good limit. Yeah.
Yeah.
You shouldn't have more hobbies than there are days in the week. Might be a
Right.
good rule.
Yes. That's good. That's good. I like that rule. So the next one is being really self-critical. So we tend to internalize the criticism that we experience throughout our lives, starting from a really young age for some of us. And my therapist once said to me that whose voice is it that you hear whenever you hear that self-critical voice? And I said, it's mine. And she's like, well, but it didn't start as your voice. We're not born with that voice. And so, it's probably a whole nother episode, but then you start trying to kind of pick out what's me and what's not me, and what did I internalize, and how can I reframe this in my mind and get past it so that I realize that I'm not all of these awful things that I'm telling myself.
Absolutely. Yeah. Parents, right?
Yeah. I mean, it really is. It really is. And I think about teachers, teachers who've said awful things that when I think about it now, I'm like, man, I was just a little girl. Like, what's wrong with you guys? It's like,
That's right. We don't have the mechanisms in place to protect ourselves. And like you said, especially for girls, it seems like girls might be more inclined to just reflexively take everything on board and assume that other
mhm.
people's
Yeah.
criticisms could be valid.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And, unfortunately, you can only hear so much criticism about yourself before you start to see what people are talking about. Even if it's not really valid, you still start to see that in yourself. And so I know a couple years ago, I had a friend, I was not well, and I had a friendship that was kind of circling the drain. And they told me, you're just toxic. You're a toxic person. And at the time, my mind frame was that maybe they're right. I started looking at all the ways that I fail as a friend and all the ways that I fail as a person. And so you start thinking, oh my gosh, they're right, I'm toxic. And of course, when I look back on it now, I'm like, I'm not toxic at all. That was awful of them to say to me. What a horrible thing to say to someone. But at the time when it happens, you start really looking at yourself and going, oh man, is this real?
Yeah. Yeah, people don't understand the damage they're doing by throwing around these negative labels. Words
Mhm.
like lazy and toxic, they're like curse words. And the
Right.
more they get repeated, the more power they have to influence our perception of reality.
Mhm.
Just like how we can manifest positive things by imagining them and thinking about
Yes.
them, we can have negative things manifested upon us.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's important. That's going back to when you asked me the advice that I would give to other parents: nurture your children's self-esteem. It's so important, and it's hard to forget about. It's hard to realize that what you're doing or what you're saying is breaking a part of them on the inside. So just that's so important, is to nurture that, because um, strong self-esteem really would have helped me in a number of ways throughout my life. So the next thing is, so this was hard for me. I couldn't really think about how to put this into words when I was writing the article. Um, but if you feel real pain from your lost potential, if you look back, and this is for more for women than for girls, but if you look back at what you could have been, what you might have been, and you kind of pine for that and you feel that pain, there's a good chance that ADHD has held you back. You know, if you're 30 and you're looking at your life, you're looking back at your life and you're saying, I never accomplished any of my goals. I never chased any of my dreams. I've always just kind of lived this mediocre existence. There's a good chance that something else is happening in your life, in your mind, in your brain. So that one's, it's painful, but it's important to recognize.
Absolutely. Yeah. Especially when we first get diagnosed, the regret and grieving what could have been really feeds that anger at the people who we feel like knew us best and should have seen these things and helped clue us in to what was going on. How do you think that you started to process and overcome those feelings? And what's your advice for others who might be working through that process now?
Well, so the first thing that I would say um, is to really ask yourself who you're angry with. I noticed that when I started asking myself that question, like I felt this intense anger. And when I started asking this question, it's like, who are you mad at? Like, and for what? So I would think, well, I can't really be mad at my parents because they didn't know. You know, they weren't doctors. They didn't know. They took me to my first therapist at 9 years old and said, there's something going on with our daughter. So they tried their best. But I still felt anger for them. And then the same with the medical community. I thought, you know, I felt let down by them and I felt this anger. But at the same time, again, it was never really anybody's individual fault that nobody noticed it. It just was the way that it happened. You know, maybe I wasn't, because a lot of things I had never told the doctor about because I didn't know they were symptoms. So, you know, there were just a lot of reasons why I didn't get a diagnosis before I did. But the number one thing with resolving that anger was realizing that I was really just kind of mad at the universe. Like I was just kind of mad at the way that the cookie crumbled. And so that I think that it was really important in kind of getting rid of some of that anger, is that realizing that it wasn't directed at anyone. It was just anger because the situation was sucky.
Yeah. And we often desperately want to find an external target to channel that anger toward.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that's really important. If you feel like you're mad at your parents, ask yourself why you're mad at your parents. You know, what specifically are you angry for? And I think most people will find that, oh, my parents had no way of knowing, you know, how would they have known? So that's definitely the first thing that I would do. And the other thing is just let yourself feel it. Accept it for what it is. Let yourself feel the emotions, and eventually it'll start to fade away because you're also going to have that excitement and that hope that's going to kind of pull you forward as well.
That's beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's what it is. I like to say that everybody did the best they could with what they had.
Yes. Yes. That's one thing that my dad kept saying. I think my dad had a really hard time and just kept saying that over and over again. As my and was a human being myself, but I realized my parents were always just doing the best that they could with the information that they had. And you know, they didn't know it was wrong, but they saw defiance and they saw laziness and they saw all these things because they didn't understand what was going on with me.
Yeah, it was a different time.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, it definitely was.
The second part of what you said is so important that I just wanted to emphasize it again quickly, which is that you transition to focusing on what's ahead of you rather than what's behind you. And now that you have the diagnosis, you do have an external target, which is your
Mhm.
condition and your symptoms. And that gives you something to actually fight against because
Yes.
it's separate from you and symptoms can be changed with treatment.
Yes, yes. And I have several other comorbid disorders, and I found the same to be true of those as well. As soon as I started learning about them and understanding them, suddenly it wasn't me anymore. It was my disorder. And that's been very helpful in my healing.
Yeah, you touched on some really important symptoms and perspectives for women and girls with ADHD. And I really appreciate you taking the time to share those thoughts with us. I'm going to do whatever I can to promote awareness of these issues that we've talked about and also of your work. Where can people find you and what do you want them to know about what you're up to?
All right. Well, you can find me at thewinterofmydiscontent.com. I post twice a week, and I try to get the most informative information about ADHD and my other disorders as I possibly can on there. Also, in the next couple of months, I am going to start coaching. So I'll have those services available. You can find me at thewinterofmydiscontent.com.
I also noticed that you are offering coaching for creatives who might be interested in getting into this space. Is that right?
Yes. So that's another thing I write about sometimes. And I also am getting ready to come out with a course, a 7 module course on how to create your own mental health blog. So I try to help as many people as I can get into the space and have their voices heard and, break stigma and do the hard work, fight the good fight.
Yeah, there's so much more work that needs to be done to create on-ramps for people to be able to find the treatment help that they need. So I really appreciate the work that you're doing for that reason. Anybody watching, please check out Amber's blog at thewinterofmydiscontent.com, and I will talk to you again soon.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.